Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks again for joining us for today's webinar, the SaaS Trends You Cannot Ignore in 2026. I'm joined today by Ben Pippenger and Michelle Baker. Ben and Michelle, take it away.
All right, thank you, Daniel, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Wherever you are, it's cold and snowy here in Indianapolis where we're based. So thank you for taking the time the next hour to really dig into one of my most exciting parts of our year when we release our annual SaaS Management Index. So we'll give a couple quick intros here. My name is Ben Pippenger. I'm one of the co-founders here at Zylo. My role is I'm VP of Strategic Partnerships. And again, just super excited to be able to share the great work that our team has put together around the SaaS Management Index. And I'm also really excited to be joined by my counterpart here today, Michelle Baker.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Baker, the Vice President of Client Success at Zylo, and I have the pleasure of serving our strategic account executives and our client success managers who work alongside our clients every day, helping them achieve their outcomes with Zylo. And Ben and I are super excited, so let's dive in.
Yeah, for sure. So before we get into the data, I'm sure there's a lot of folks on today that maybe do or don't know about the SaaS Management Index. So I want to explain a little bit about what this report actually is. So the SaaS Management Index is Zylo's annual benchmark report on how companies manage SaaS at scale. We're using anonymized, aggregated platform data where we analyze how companies actually spend, use, and renew SaaS. So as we walk through the findings today, the goal is to help you understand what's changing in SaaS economics and what that means for how SaaS needs to be managed going into 2026. One quick note before we move on, what you're seeing today is a confidential preview of the report. We'll be sharing the full report on January 29th, so please hold off on sharing these findings publicly until then. All right, to help put some additional context around this, let's take a look at the scale of the underlying data that we're reporting on. This report is built on the industry's largest SaaS data set. Over $40 million SaaS licenses, $75 billion in SaaS spend that's been collected across 9 years. With this level of scale and history, we're able to identify trends that consistently show up across environments. So let's start with the first major finding from this year's report. The first major finding is that SaaS spend is increasing, but portfolio sizes are not. So what does that actually look like? On average, organizations are now spending about $55 million annually on SaaS, which is up roughly 8% year over year. Now, at the same time, the average number of applications sits around 305, and that number year over year is essentially flat. So historically, those two lines move together. If your app count went up, your spend went up. If you consolidated, your cost came down.
Right, which is probably what most teams still expect. But what we're seeing now is that relationship breaking. Spend is rising, even though portfolios aren't growing. And we're seeing this pattern across companies of all sizes.
Yeah, so let's look at those sizes. So we break this data out by cohort so you can see where you fit. When you look across the board, SaaS spend is increasing in every one of the segments. I do want to call it enterprises. They stand out in particular. The average spend is now about $245 million annually, and that's up roughly 16% year over year. App counts are growing for enterprises, but not at the same pace that spend is growing.
Yeah, it's a great point, Ben. And when we see spend outpacing app growth like this, let's talk a little bit about what's actually driving it.
Yeah, totally. Well, at first glance, it's easy to assume that it's just vendors increasing prices, which I'm sure a lot of you are experiencing right now. And the pricing pressure is absolutely part of the story here. It doesn't fully explain what we're seeing. What's really happening is more structural, and it starts with what's going on inside of SaaS portfolios. This is what's actually happening underneath those flat portfolio numbers. On average, organizations are adding just over 8 new applications every month. Over the course of a year, that means roughly a third of their portfolio is new. What this tells us is that portfolios are highly dynamic. Companies are constantly adding new tools, but also consolidating or retiring others to make room. That's why the total app count can look stable year over year, even though there's a lot of movement happening inside of their SaaS stack. So if you're not removing redundant apps or canceling non-critical SaaS, your overall app count and spend figures would be eye-popping.
So, Ben, what's interesting is if the overall numbers aren't really growing, why does this level of churn matter in practice?
Well, when teams are constantly swapping tools, there's as additional costs, risk, and governance starts to get harder. The challenge isn't really the size of the portfolio anymore, it's the volatility of the change inside of it.
Right. And we're working to provide a lot of value with our clients in that moment that matters, renewals. And when we're changing over a third of your stack each year, you need to make sure you're staying on top of any auto renewals and you're also preparing in advance for the renewal itself.
Yeah, totally. We talk about this a lot at Zylo. The renewal is the moment of truth. It's that moment that matters. So far we've talked about what is happening inside SaaS portfolios. Now let's take a step back and really unpack why this level of change is happening in the first place. So, Michelle, we're going to jump into here. What's actually driving all of this? What's behind the growth we're seeing? And I'm guessing a lot of participants on the webinar today probably have a pretty solid guess. We've been talking about it for a while. Yep, it's AI. When we isolate AI native applications, and by AI native applications, I mean tools like ChatGPT or Claude, where the AI is sort of core, the growth is dramatic. Across the board, spend is up more than 100% year over year. And the largest organizations, it's nearly 4 times higher than it was last year.
Yeah, when people see numbers like this, the instinct is to start asking, what AI tools do we have? Or how many AI apps are in our environment? Is this actually the right way to think about it, Ben?
That's exactly where a lot of teams go. But honestly, the reality is at this point, almost every SaaS application already has AI in it, is built on it, or they're adding it very quickly on the roadmap. So if you're only trying to track AI apps, you're missing a big part of the picture. In 2026, AI is just baked into your SaaS stack. It shows up everywhere. That's why visibility into all your SaaS matters so much, not just your AI tools.
Right. This kind of reminds me of when software moved from on-prem to cloud and all software essentially became SaaS.
Yeah, Michelle, that's actually a great parallel. If you think about SaaS apps adding AI, they're hooking into platform LLMs in order to add AI to their infrastructure. They're all doing it. The parallel you draw is when software moved from installed in your data center to hosted in the cloud. They all pretty much did it. And something else that is important to call out, when they did this, they changed their pricing models. The reality is that the old way of charging for SaaS simply isn't designed for this. There's a disconnect between how vendors incur costs and how we've traditionally paid for them. So just like the move to subscription-based software, a new era of SaaS pricing is emerging. And that's really exactly what we're seeing in the headlines. Vendors are rethinking how they monetize AI as it becomes embedded into SaaS. We're seeing a shift away from seat-based licensing toward consumption-based models where pricing is tied to usage. Seat-based licensing hasn't disappeared, but AI is adding new pricing layers on top of it. And those layers behave very differently than traditional SaaS. You can see this shift really clearly when you look at how vendors are pricing in the market. Let's actually take a step back here and look at some third-party data. So what's on the screen right here is data from a study that McKinsey has done. It's a great report on upgrading software business models to thrive in the AI era. And I found this data really, really interesting, and it hits this point really well. So what the chart is showing is the difference between how traditional SaaS providers price today versus how AI native providers are pricing. So there's a lot on here, so let me just quickly break it down for you. You'll see 2 bars in the middle of the screen. The top bar are incumbent software providers. These are going to be your more traditional SaaS products. Below that are the AI natives. So AI natives are going to be those products that are built in the era of AI. AI is at their core. It's fundamental to everything that they're doing. The bars across the inside of those bars, the different percentages where we're seeing a couple different things. So that dark bar are what they're calling flat fees. So these are going to be platform fees or costs or seats, something that you're paying sort of upfront as part of your contract. The next shade over are successful outcome-based pricing. So these are outcome pricing models like potentially a case resolution or an opportunity closed. Those would all be outcomes that you may have a pricing model tied to that AI is doing for you. Next are consumption. So consumption is going to be sort of what you think about, especially if you're used to infrastructure pricing, where you're buying a bucket of things that you consume through or making a certain commitment level that you need to monitor and track. And lastly, our capacity. Capacity is where you're buying like a certain amount of storage and you have up to that amount of storage before you enter into some sort of overage fee once you go over that capacity level. So as you can see here, the top bar again is those incumbents. Below that's AI natives. Incumbents are still, primarily over 0.5% or over 50%, excuse me, flat fee or seat-based models. We're starting to see them add in these new consumption pricing models. Below that are those AI native tools where the story's sort of flipped, right? You're still going to see some of those flat fees. So those would be like hybrid pricing models, or maybe there's some sort of platform fee that you pay to get access to it. But primarily they're pricing based off of those consumption-based pricing model solutions.
Yeah, so the important takeaway is that pricing is moving away from predictable seats and towards usage that can scale very quickly. And that change makes costs much less predictable, and which teams are already starting to experience.
Yeah, that's totally right, Michelle. And actually part of the report this year, we ran a survey that went out to about 200 IT leaders. These folks are not current Zylo clients, and the company's over 1,000 employees, where at least half of their stack is SaaS. And the results we're seeing are pretty aligned with the data that we're sharing here.
Yeah, so as pricing models shift, this is where the impact starts to show up for teams. Nearly 80% of organizations saw price increases at renewal in the past year, and more than 3/4 experienced unexpected charges tied back to consumption or AI features. And then for 61%, that volatility actually led to projects being cut. So what's important here is that this volatility is disrupting how teams are able to plan and budget appropriately.
And I think it's also important that when teams talk about unexpected costs, it's not that they didn't plan at all.
Right.
It's that the way pricing is changing makes it much harder to predict what software will actually cost once usage starts ramping.
Exactly. And traditional SaaS pricing was relatively static. You bought seats, you knew your annual costs, and changes showed up mostly at renewal. With AI and consumption-based pricing, costs can now move inside the contract term. And that means volatility shows up sooner and more often than expected. And you need to be proactively monitoring so you don't end up with overage fees. But the challenge is that many of these costs aren't even coming through your main procurement channels.
Yep, that's right. Shadow IT is back, and we're calling it Shadow AI. So far, we talked a lot about AI driving app churn and cost volatility. But the next question is, how is all this actually getting into the organization? And a lot of it is coming through expense systems. So expense-based SaaS spend is up 267% year over year when we look at last year compared to this year. And ChatGPT is now the most expensed application overall, when we look at 24 to 25. And let me hit that point one more time there. So ChatGPT is the most expensed application overall. So the demand for AI is moving faster than traditional intake and approval processes can keep up with.
Yeah, when you look at that level of Gen AI redundancy, so roughly 7 tools on average, what does that actually tell us? Is this really about waste, or is it more about how quickly teams are experimenting and trying to solve problems within their business?
Yeah, what I've seen, Michelle, is much more about speed than waste. Teams are actively experimenting. They're testing different tools. They're needing to move quickly in order to get the value that they're looking to achieve. The problem, though, is that organizations lose sight of how many similar tools that they're paying for, who's using them, and how their costs are scaling. So over time, it creates a portfolio that's very, very hard to govern.
Yeah, it creates this tension, right? So on one hand, you have some enterprises moving cautious to adopt AI because of regulatory risks, but others are eager to experiment. Both sides have valid concerns. So the balance isn't really about saying yes or no. It's more yes with guardrails. So I was just on a call last week with one of our most innovative enterprises, and they're rolling out different processes and ways to enable teams to experiment and innovate, but in a controlled manner in order to stay ahead. So the key is you need to have visibility and review processes in place because there are risks, and otherwise it can turn into the Wild West with shadow AI. But the truth is, it's difficult for IT to maintain order when they're no longer own the majority of the tech stack.
Yep, and that leads me right into sort of this next slide here. This is where a lot of the trends that we've been talking about really come together. When we look at who's actually bringing SaaS into the organization, the balance has shifted pretty dramatically. Business units now control just over 80% of SaaS spend and more than half of all applications. IT, by comparison, manages about 15% of the spend and 13% of the total app count. The challenge is that while SaaS is being bought through decentralized budgets and expense spend, IT is still being tapped and accountable for security, compliance, and a lot of the costs. So that mismatch is what makes SaaS so much harder to manage today.
Right. And you can see that IT share has become narrower each year. And this really feels like the backdrop of everything else we've talked about today. AI adoption, pricing volatility, shadow AI, all of it gets harder when ownership is this fragmented.
Yeah, exactly. When ownership is distributed, cost control has to look different. It has to focus on visibility, on shared data, and clear accountability across teams. And the real world consequences of distributed ownership shows up clearly in the budget, specifically in what's being paid for, but not actually used. So one of the encouraging things in this year's data is that license utilization has actually improved. On average, organizations are now using about 54% of their SaaS licenses, which is up year over year. But even with that improvement, nearly half of all licenses are still going unused. So when we translate that into dollars, it adds up to almost $20 million in annual waste for the average organization. And that's largely because when SaaS is owned everywhere, no one truly owns usage. So usage has improved, which is promising, but it still hasn't eliminated SaaS waste.
Yeah, and that's why improving usage is table stakes. So usage data creates awareness, but it only turns into savings when there's clear ownership and a process to actually act on it, like preparing in advance and acting on it at renewal.
Agreed. And when there's a large amount of waste, there's an opportunity to rein it in, realize savings. And I think the most important thing is then reinvest that into innovation or AI initiatives. Now, don't get me wrong, there's budget being opened up for AI, but it's probably not enough. You need to get out ahead of the waste and reinvest those savings. There are companies that are doing that today very successfully. And when you look at those teams, there are a few clear things that they're doing differently. So what we found is that it all comes down to having a consistent, repeatable process. The organizations that are navigating this well have created a consistent way of working across their teams. Michelle, where are they applying that process to actually move the needle?
Right. So it's all about renewals. For seat-based SaaS, renewals are still your biggest control point organizations have. They're the only time you can reduce that spend. So the average organization is managing more than 200 renewal events every year. And 87% of SaaS spend is tied to renewal versus net new purchases.
Yeah, that's definitely a huge opportunity for teams.
It is. And our most successful clients operationalize renewals and treat it as a true discipline. They start the process early, they're using usage data to right size, and they're rationalizing apps to fund innovation like you talked about earlier.
And so without that discipline, contracts would just auto renew or get no visibility. Is that right?
Right. So exactly. When you manage renewals consistently, you can turn them into this predictable savings pipeline. And on average, that's nearly 28 million in annual savings opportunity. That's assuming roughly 50% of your annual spend is up for renewal each year. But to actually capture those savings, you need a standard way of operating.
So let's take a look at that
Yeah.
standard line.
Yeah, so that's what we mean by renewal discipline. What we're really describing is operationalizing renewals and turning it into this repeatable process. And this process is what our most successful clients are doing consistently to realize savings.
Okay, so let's sort of walk through this here. So step one is visibility. You need to have a centralized view of your spend, your usage, and your renewal dates from your contracts. Step two then is about prioritization. Not every renewal matters equally. Teams often focus first on the contracts with the highest spend, or they look at renewals that are coming up the soonest.
Right. And then step 3 is change management. And this is really important. Leaders within the organization need to be bought in and they need to clearly articulate to the broader organizations that savings is a priority. And you need executive alignment in order to prioritize this initiative, and you need to define clear processes. Step 4 is when we pivot into execution. So, our most successful teams start preparing early, like I said. They have structure, they have proactive timelines that they follow leading up to renewal. And then they right size based on the usage and go on to negotiate with that data.
Yep, and I'm lucky I get to talk about step 5, which is my favorite,
Mhm.
where we get to show the money here. Is closing the loop with value reporting. So IT, procurement, finance, and business teams should have visibility into the results so that builds accountability and reinforces the impact of your program. So when you do all of this consistently, renewals start becoming a predictable savings engine.
Right, exactly. So, if you can execute on that process, you are set up for success. But as we look ahead at the data for 2026, it's clear that SaaS pricing models have evolved and the way we manage that spend has evolved right along with them.
Yep, totally, Michelle. The reality is that everything we've talked about so far about renewals works really well for seat-based SaaS. But when your costs are tied to usage, you can't just look at it once a year at the renewal time.
Right. But more important thing to say is that seat based pricing isn't disappearing entirely. Even AI leaders like OpenAI and Claude use hybrid models, which combine seat based pricing and consumption based models. And that's where the complexity is because when spend is variable, it's something you have to manage continuously.
Yeah, and I guess the good news is there's already a proven model for this. The cloud or your FinOps team in the world has been managing variable usage-based costs for years. So they're starting to bring that same discipline into SaaS. Now, what's interesting is how fast they've responded to the shift. So the FinOps Foundation, which puts together a formal discipline that describes how to manage the cloud, has focused on managing variable technology spend, and historically that's meant your cloud infrastructure. But now we're seeing FinOps teams step into SaaS and AI spend in a much bigger way. In fact, 63% of FinOps teams are already managing AI spend, and SaaS is now the fastest growing area of FinOps responsibility.
Yeah, that makes sense because, like we mentioned earlier, SaaS is starting to behave a lot more like cloud.
Yep, totally. It's becoming more variable and usage driven.
Yeah, and that's where ITAM and FinOps start to come together around the same problem. And I think it also changes who owns the responsibility. This isn't just an ITAM or procurement problem.
Yep, for sure. It's becoming a shared responsibility across IT, finance, and the business. And for those teams to stay ahead, they need a new foundational practice in order to keep everything on track. So once pricing becomes consumption based, you can't control costs just at renewal. It's something you have to manage continuously.
Yeah, so renewals are still a key lever, but they don't give you continuous control.
Right. So you really have to apply a FinOps style discipline to SaaS. And it really comes down to 4 foundational practices. The first is monitoring usage trends. You need to understand how consumption has behaved over time so you're not surprised when it changes. Second, you need to forecast your future spend or your future usage using historical usage data to project where costs are heading.
Yeah, and once you have that baseline and forecast in place, alerts are a critical part of making this manageable. Alerts help catch anomalies before costs spike. And then finally, breaking down usage. When you can attribute consumption to specific users, teams, or project, you now know where spend comes from and why.
Exactly. And that's why we're so excited about what's coming next from Zylo this quarter. You'll start seeing new consumption enhancements rolling out with deeper consumption visibility, monitoring, forecasting, and alerting. If you don't know, DocuSign envelope consumption tracking is available now. If you're a current Zylo client, you can see it in your account if that's how you're structured with DocuSign. OpenAI for their API is now in preview, and Anthropic and Gemini are coming very soon after.
Yeah, this is really exciting. And what I really like about this is that teams can start small when they're managing consumption spend and build from there.
Yeah, one thing that we want to be very clear about is that managing consumption-based spend doesn't have to happen all at once.
Right. This is very much a crawl, walk, run journey.
Yeah, totally. And if any of you are familiar with FinOps, they talk a lot about crawl, walk, runs, and this is really no different. So in the crawl stage, it's about establishing visibility, just understanding where consumption exists and how it's been trending over time. At this point, you're beginning to make sure you won't end up in an overage situation.
Yeah. So before optimization, you're just getting oriented. You're building a baseline and answering really basic questions like what are we paying for and what's driving change month to month.
Yeah, totally. And then, sort of as we move from crawl to walk, next in that walk stage, you start to build predictability. That's forecasting spend, consumption, setting alerts, and catching spikes early so there are fewer surprises when the bill shows up.
Right. And like I mentioned earlier, you're starting to connect usage back to teams or projects, which makes those changes easier to explain and potentially plan for.
Yep, for sure, Michelle. And I do want to make sure it's clear too that in these crawl and walk stages, that's where teams typically start to see savings and cost avoidance outcomes. And over time, the mature teams reach the run phase where they can optimize and govern continuously. They're able to do cost allocations and doing showbacks and chargebacks and distributing ownership across the business. They're in a position to change how they're optimizing usage in order to save in the long run.
Yeah, and that's where maturity comes over time. The key takeaway is that progress is incremental. You don't need to solve everything on day one. Each stage builds on the last one.
All right, that is great. Hopefully, everyone sort of took note of that process around consumption.
Yeah. What we shared today is just a slice of the data. The full report goes much deeper with additional benchmarks, trends, and guidance that you can use to understand your own SaaS environment. And we hope it gives you something useful to take back to your teams.
Yeah, again, we'll send the full report out to everyone on January 29th. So keep an eye out for that in your inbox. You'll get it first before it goes out more broadly for participating in the webinar today. Thank you so much for joining us. We really, really appreciate it. And with that, let's open it up to some questions.
Ben, thank you so much, Ben and Michelle. First question we have, can you speak to Zylo's vendor risk management integrations?
Yeah, so our vendor risk management integration. So we've got integrations into Netscope in order to pull back and understand the cloud cost index and some other variables that they provide, including certifications and compliance for a whole number of the applications that we have inside of our application library. And then when we do our discovery process, we bring all that data forward so then you can see sort of what your security posture is of the different applications and vendors that you're working with.
Great. Next question. Forecasting spend can be hard to do when we may not have enough historical data yet to base a forecast on. What suggestions do you have for how to get started when you don't yet have the historical data that you need?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, if you're just getting started, obviously you're not going to have a lot of historical information in order to base that consumption forecast, that spend forecast on, like you're calling out. I think in that type of scenario, you really need to talk to the business and really try to understand what their needs look like and who's going to be leveraging whatever tool it is that you're using. We use a specific model for our forecasting solution within the consumption product that we've brought to the market. That doesn't take a lot of historical data, and at least to get a perspective, but then sort of constantly updates over time in order to provide you with the most accurate forecast possible. So I think, to answer the question directly, it would be, I think you really need to partner with the business as you're bringing on new tools to understand what that need looks like, and then monitor it really, really closely to make sure that sort of your needs don't get outside of what your expectations are.
Great. Next question. What's the impact of all of these unexpected costs? So what's the cost of doing nothing?
Yeah, I think what we touched on a little bit earlier is, without monitoring this regularly, that's where these unexpected spends are hitting, which is having such an impact in the overall planning and budgeting. Like I said, the survey results that we had, a lot of projects had to get cut, and so you're lacking that consistency and predictability for the business. So best well-laid plans, it's being able to stay on top of that more regularly is critical.
And I'd add I'd add one point to that too. I mean, the data shows that primarily across on average, the app stack stayed flat, but spend went up. I mean, the enterprise was a little bit different, but we saw a 16% increase in spend and a moderate increase in the app count. So if nothing is done, you can imagine with like that churn of that volatility that we saw, where a third of the stack is turning over, you're going to just be stacking those costs on top of everything else if you're doing nothing to remove low value or redundant tools. That's sort of the answer to that one. And then I think on the waste side, you always should be looking at your licensing and your usage and running ELPs and doing things like that prior to renewal, so that as you're going into those conversations, you're well equipped and prepared to have the right conversation for what you actually need and adjust your contract accordingly to remove that waste.
Great. Next question. How will Zylo address cost model changes in SaaS?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So it's something we're constantly monitoring. So, as pricing models change, we actually just experienced this with Smartsheet in the past year. Their pricing model changed. Their integration didn't support sort of the new way to price things. As soon as they release new capabilities in order to provide the data that we need to help you then measure any pricing model changes, we'll be all over that and make sure we can get those updates into the application as fast as possible. I think on the sort of the consumption side and the AI side, I mean, everything is moving very, very quickly. We have teams of product folks and engineers that are focused on doing the research, understanding those pricing models, and bringing, for example, those tools I mentioned earlier to market. And we'll constantly be evolving those and updating them as pricing models adjust and change over time.
Getting a lot of questions here, so appreciate your patience. Next question. The biggest challenge is establishing the visibility. So with the limited direct integration capability to collect consumption usage data, what is the second best approach to establishing visibility?
Yeah, I think, so when I think about visibility, I think about it in a couple ways. One is visibility to your inventory. I think if you're a Zylo client, you experience this. If you're not, we've got sort of the industry's best way to find SaaS applications, and that's primarily through your spend data. And we've got that model that the same data is built off of. It's built on about $75-80 billion in spend data that analyzes all that in order to find and attribute that spend and bring those applications into your inventory. That's sort of step one, right? To find what apps do I have, what am I spending on them, and then we got to figure out, okay, which ones are we going to prioritize to get contracts and get all the information that we need to fully onboard that app into your inventory. I think the question went a little bit into sort of usage and consumption and things like that. Usage data, we pull that through a multiple different ways: direct integration, single sign-on, then also through our product called Usage Connect. With consumption, we're actively working to bring new consumption applications into the fold so that you can pull that data in through a very similar integration experience. Some of the more traditional SaaS providers aren't providing that data yet through an API or through an integration approach, but as soon as they do, you can trust that we'll be all over those to also get those added into the system.
Great. Next question. Do you think there will be a move towards companies pressuring seat-based models to move towards consumption to consumption-based pricing models? So from seat-based models to consumption-based models.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a theory on this. Michelle, feel free to add to this. I mean, I think that as we continue to see AI take hold and applications be able to do more with not as many people having to log into the system, you are going to see pricing models shift to be less about seats and more about the job and the work that their system is doing on your behalf to achieve those outcomes. So I don't know if it necessarily be pressure. I just think there'll be a shift in the market. I loved the parallel that Michelle drove around sort of going from sort of installed software into the cloud and like what that did to pricing models. I mean, there's probably some people that still have perpetual licensing, but a lot of those have even moved to subscription-based pricing models. That was a huge transition. I'm definitely expecting that we'll see something similar here with seats into some sort of consumption outcome-driven pricing scenario. Which hopefully will always be a fair exchange of value. So I think that's up to you all to look at that and make sure that that's the case as you're talking to your vendors. But I think that's probably the most important underlying part.
Great. Next question: how long should we give our users to consume to learn? Do you see consumption being a larger component of the spend while AI is growing, or do you see it getting bigger and bigger every year?
I think for the first part, in terms of giving users, I think a lot of our clients have committees dedicated to AI. And so I think it's important to get alignment within your broader organization of what that would look like. I'm not seeing any hard and fast times that they're giving their teams to spend. It's more so, like we said, putting those guardrails in place. And you have to think about what makes sense based on your industry and your organization. So certainly something to talk about probably more broadly, maybe at a committee basis within your organization. And then the second part, I don't know if you had thoughts on that. Ben, what was that second part again?
Second part? Just want to make sure I have it. Daniel, you there?
What was the second part of the question?
Second part of that question.
Oh, sorry. Do you see consumption being a larger component of the spend while AI is growing, or do you see it getting bigger and bigger every year?
I think there will probably be in tandem. Like I think a lot of the traditional SaaS vendors that you all work with, as they add AI capabilities, they'll be adjusting their pricing to sort of again go back to like that new capability that's probably acting on your behalf or on the behalf of what was formerly a seat or a user. So I think they're probably in tandem. We'll see both those things happen hand in hand.
Next question, how do you monitor usage-based contracts? Is this through direct API integrations with SaaS providers? If the API isn't available, how do you track consumption?
Yeah, that's a good question. So definitely the API-based integrations are our first priority. If that data is available and then aligned to how our application consumes that's definitely what we're going after as quickly as we can. If that data is not available, I think we would still be able to pull in your contract and your agreement and help you understand what's going on and play that out. But you'll either have to log into the admin panel if that's where it exists, or potentially bring it in through Usage Connect as well, which is our way to get data in if there's not integration available for that particular vendor.
Great. See, next question. When a SaaS organization is evaluating your licensing, how do they determine consumption if not on a seat-by-seat basis?
Do you get that? Can you say that one more time, Daniel?
Sure. When a SaaS organization is evaluating your licensing, how do they determine consumption if not on a seat-by-seat basis?
I think, I sort of look at them as two different models, and Michelle, maybe if you're understanding this a little bit better, I think, a seat-based model is going to be if, you're an app and you want 100 users within your organization for that particular application, you're going to buy a seat from them and then provision that out. And then that seat's taken, right? So now you're down to 99 left. Versus consumption is going to be, you're buying a volume of some unit of use. that you're going to burn through the course of that relationship that you have with that vendor. And there's different ways, lots of different consumption models that organizations are using. But that's sort of at the core, the foundation. I mean, lots of companies will do commitment models and other things, which we can talk about in a whole different session. But so I see them as two different ones. Where there becomes like a hybrid approach where you see both of them would be like, take like ChatGPT, right? Like with ChatGPT, if you got an enterprise agreement, you give someone a seat. So I give Michelle a seat that takes away one of the seats I have, but then she is capped at a certain amount of token usage within a time frame. And then if she goes over that token usage, there's an overage fee as a result of that. So that's where that hybrid scenario comes in, where you'd see both, where you give someone access, but then they're capped at the amount of activity that they can drive within that particular platform.
Yeah, I think about it, the activity that is being driven. So you may be able to, like you said, tie back where there is heavy usage on particular teams or individuals. But yeah, I think about the two separately, but we're obviously seeing models where they're blending the two.
Great. I think that's all the questions we have for today. Ben and Michelle, thank you so much. A recording will be sent out later this week to everybody who registered and attended today's webinar. So thank you so much for showing up today. And Ben and Michelle, anything you want to add?
Thank you all for joining. You'll have this in inboxes by the 29th. Very excited.
Yeah, thank you all, and looking forward to getting feedback on the report. So thanks for the time today, and yeah, enjoy your day.